The mansion stood in eerie silence, its grand chandeliers casting long shadows across the marble floors. Ethan Calloway sat in his study, a glass of whiskey untouched in front of him. The fire crackled in the massive stone fireplace, but no warmth could reach the ice settling in his chest. His fingers tightened around the crystal tumbler, the weight of his mother's words crushing him like an iron fist. "She's barren. Ethan, do you understand what that means for this family?" His mother's voice, Margaret Calloway, had always been sharp, calculated, like every move she made in their world of wealth and power. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't need to. Every syllable landed like a blade, cutting with precision. The Calloway name must continue. You have an obligation, to this family, to our legacy. You cannot waste years on a woman who can give you nothing. Ethan's jaw clenched. His wife, Isabel, was everything to him. She was kind, compassionate, the only person who had ever seen him beyond the ruthless businessman he had become. But his mother didn't care about love. She only cared about the Calloway empire. "You are the head of this family now," Margaret had continued, her cold gaze unwavering. "A Calloway does not cling to dead weight." Dead weight, that's what she had called Isabel. The woman who had given him her heart, her trust, her unwavering support. The woman he had promised to cherish for better or worse. Yet here he was, sitting in the suffocating grandeur of his home, knowing what he was about to do. The study door creaked open, and Isabel stepped inside. She wore a simple blue dress, her long auburn hair cascading over her shoulders. Her beauty was effortless, not the kind that needed designer labels or expensive jewelry. It was the warmth in her brown eyes, the quiet strength in her posture. She smiled softly, oblivious to the storm brewing inside him. "You're home early," she said, setting a book down on the coffee table. "I was thinking we could have dinner together. Just the two of us." Ethan's grip tightened on the glass. The guilt was already eating him alive. He couldn't meet her eyes. "Isabel," he began, his voice lower than he intended. "We need to talk." The change in his tone made her pause. Her smile faltered, and a flicker of worry crossed her face. "What's wrong?" He stood abruptly, shoving his hands into his pockets as he turned away from her. The weight of the decision felt unbearable. But he had already made it. Or rather, his mother had made it for him. "You have to let her go. Ethan, do it now, before she ruins everything." Ethan swallowed hard and forced himself to say the words. I think we should separate." The silence that followed was suffocating. Isabel blinked, as if she hadn't heard him correctly. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Then, in a whisper, "What?" The heartbreak in her voice nearly crushed him. Ethan clenched his fists, forcing himself to keep going. "It's been 3 years, Isabel. We've tried, and nothing has changed. We're not building the life we hoped for." Her hands trembled as she stepped forward. "Ethan, we're happy. I love you. That's all that matters." He exhaled sharply, his chest aching. He wished that were true. But in his world, love wasn't enough. "I want children, Isabel. And we both know that's not going to happen." The words tasted like poison, bitter and cruel. A sharp inhale, a step backward. She touched her stomach, a reflex, as if she could somehow change the truth of her own body. "So that's what this is about," she whispered. "You're leaving me because I can't give you an heir?" He didn't answer. Because the truth was worse than that. He wasn't leaving her because he wanted to. He was leaving her because he was too much of a coward to stand up to his mother. Her voice broke. "You promised me, Ethan. You said we'd face everything together. I believed you." He turned away, unable to look at her tear-filled eyes. "I'm sorry," he said, but the words were empty. Isabel let out a breath that shattered something inside him. "If you walk away from me now," she whispered, "I don't think I'll ever forgive you." Ethan's heart thundered against his ribs. But he had already made his choice. He reached for the doorknob, his fingers tightening around the cold metal. She was right there, and yet, he had never felt further away from her. The door clicked shut behind him. And with it, he knew, he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The storm outside mirrored the one raging inside Isabel. Rain lashed against the windows as she stood in the empty foyer, her suitcase at her feet. Ethan leaned against the staircase railing, his face impassive, but his hands trembling at his sides. Isabel's voice trembled. "Say something, anything." Ethan remained silent. "One last plea. Ethan, please, don't do this." His jaw tightened. It's better this way. A single tear slipped down her cheek. Better for who? She asked, her voice breaking. For your mother? She shook her head, letting out a broken laugh. You're a coward, Ethan. His stomach twisted, but he didn't argue. She lifted the suitcase, her hands shaking, as she stepped out into the storm. She didn't look back. Neither did he. Not then. But years later, he would regret it more than anything in the world. What do you think of Ethan's decision? Leave a comment below. Did this introduction grab your heart? Hit like to show your support. Subscribe for the next part of this emotional journey. This is just the beginning, and the past has a way of catching up. Stay tuned. The city skyline stretched endlessly before Ethan Calloway as he stared out of his penthouse window. Whiskey glass in hand, the hum of New York traffic echoed from the streets below. A dull reminder of the life he had built, a life of wealth, power, and endless distractions. Yet, in the quiet moments, when the city noise couldn't drown out his thoughts, her face haunted him. Isabel. It had been 7 years since he last saw her, 7 years since he made the worst mistake of his life. 7 years since he let his mother dictate his future, tearing apart the only woman who had ever truly loved him. For years, he had buried himself in work, in meaningless relationships, in anything that kept him from feeling the weight of his own regret. He had convinced himself that walking away had been the right decision, that Isabel had moved on, that he had done what was necessary. But late at night, when he was alone with his thoughts, he knew the truth. He had broken not just her heart, but his own. And nothing, not success, not wealth, not even time, had been able to fix it. Then, fate intervened. It happened at LAX airport. Ethan was on his way back from a business trip in Los Angeles, where he had spent the last week negotiating a multi-million-dollar merger. He moved through the terminal with the same detached confidence that had always defined him, until he saw her. The moment Isabel Calloway stepped into view, time stopped. She stood by the gate, rummaging through her purse, her hair slightly tousled from travel. She wore a simple blue dress, the same shade she used to wear when she'd curl up next to him on quiet Sunday mornings, reading books while he pretended to work. For a moment, he forgot how to breathe. She looked different, not in a bad way, but in a way that made something in his chest tighten. Stronger, more radiant. But what shattered his world completely, what sent a chill through his veins and nearly knocked him off balance, wasn't Isabel herself. It was the two little boys standing beside her. Twins. Identical twins. And they looked exactly like him. Ethan's heart slammed against his ribs as he took an involuntary step forward, his pulse roaring in his ears. He couldn't be imagining this. Their sandy brown hair, the sharp line of their jaws, even the way one of them furrowed his brows in deep concentration as he played with the zipper on his backpack, it was like looking at his own childhood reflection. No, this isn't possible. A cold sweat prickled the back of his neck. He had been gone for 7 years. 7. And the boys looked around 6. The realization hit him like a freight train. They were his. They had to be his. His legs felt frozen, his body locked in place as he watched them. These two little boys who carried his blood, his features, his very existence, and he had never even known they existed. His mind raced, desperate for answers. Had Isabel been pregnant when he left? Had she known? Had she been carrying their children while he walked away? Blind and ignorant? A mix of rage, devastation, and disbelief tore through him. How could she have kept this from him? How could she have gone through everything alone? And then, as if sensing him, Isabel turned. Their eyes met, and in that moment, everything else disappeared. Her expression shifted from casual contentment to sheer, unguarded shock. Her lips parted slightly, her hands tightening around the handles of the boys' carry-ons. Ethan watched as emotions flashed across her face, first surprise, then panic, and finally, a quiet, guarded resolve. She wasn't happy to see him. She wasn't relieved or excited or even curious. She was defensive, wary, ready to run. That realization cut deeper than he expected. Before he could think, before he could stop himself, he took a step toward her. Isabel, he breathed, his voice barely above a whisper. She flinched. Then, like a protective mother lion, she immediately moved in front of the boys, shielding them from his view. Her reaction stung, but Ethan pushed forward. Isabel, he tried again, his voice raw with disbelief. Are they mine?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she squared her shoulders and met his gaze with fire in her eyes. "They're my sons," she said simply. The words weren't a confirmation, but they weren't a denial either. Ethan felt like the ground had just been ripped out from under him. His sons, his children, his family, one he never knew he had, one he never had the chance to love, to protect, to raise, and Isabel had kept them from him. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question left his lips before he could stop it. Filled with raw, unfiltered emotion, Isabel exhaled sharply, her jaw tightening. "You don't get to ask me that," she said, her voice like steel. "Not after what you did." His chest ached. "I would have." "You would have what?" she interrupted, her eyes flashing with anger. "Stayed? Fought for us? For them?" She shook her head, laughing bitterly. "No, Ethan, you left. You made your choice a long time ago." Guilt slammed into him with brutal force. He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that he hadn't chosen to leave her, that he had been manipulated, pressured, forced. But had he really? At the end of the day, he was the one who walked away. And now, he was paying the price. "Mom," one of the boys tugged at Isabel's sleeve, looking up at her with innocent, curious eyes. "Who is that man?" Ethan's heart shattered, because that was his son, his own flesh and blood. And the boy had no idea who he was. Isabel's lips pressed into a thin line. "No one, sweetheart," she said, her voice painfully steady. "Just someone I used to know." Ethan felt like she had stabbed him straight through the chest. Just someone she used to know. That's what he was to her now. The mother of his children had erased him from their lives completely. And in that moment, Ethan knew, he couldn't just walk away. Not again. Not now. Not when his sons were standing right in front of him, completely unaware that he was their father. Not when he had the chance to finally make things right. "Isabel, please," he said, his voice lower, more desperate. "I need to talk to you." She hesitated. For a moment, he thought she might say no, that she would grab their bags, take their hands, and disappear from his life again before he ever had the chance to fix what he had broken. But then, she exhaled shakily. "Fine," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But not here." Ethan nodded quickly, his pulse racing, his heart pounding with something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. For the first time since the day he lost her, he had hope. And he would do anything, to make sure this time he didn't lose her again. Isabel Calloway had never imagined her life would come to this. 7 years ago, she was a woman who had everything she had ever wanted, a man she loved, a home filled with warmth, and dreams of a future filled with laughter and love. Then, in a single moment, it was all ripped away. Ethan had left her, without a second thought, without a fight, without even asking if she was okay. And when she had stood there in the pouring rain outside the Calloway estate, her suitcase clutched in trembling hands, she had felt like the world had swallowed her whole. But nothing, compared to what came next. 3 weeks later, alone in a rundown motel, staring at the pregnancy test in her shaking hands, her entire body went numb. She was pregnant, with twins. The universe was cruel. It had given her the very thing she and Ethan had dreamed of. The children they had once spoken about in whispers under the covers late at night, but in the most heartbreaking, devastating way possible. She wanted to tell him. She almost called him. But then she remembered the cold finality in his voice. The way he had told her that it was over. That she wasn't the woman he needed. That she was nothing to him anymore. And Isabel made a choice. She would raise these children on her own. Even if she had nothing. Even if she had to build her life from the ground up. So, with what little savings she had left, Isabel packed her bags and left New York, leaving behind the ghosts of a life that had abandoned her. Chicago was cruel in the winter. The first few months were the hardest. She had no job, no home, no support. Her belly grew rounder by the day. A painful reminder that soon, she wouldn't just be struggling for herself, she would have 2 tiny lives depending on her. She slept in cheap motels, rationing food just to make it last longer. Some nights, she went hungry, just so she could save enough to afford the next day's meal. She applied for every job she could find, waitressing, cashier work, even janitorial shifts at local businesses. But with her growing belly, no one wanted to hire her. They all saw her as a burden. "You're due soon?" one manager had asked. eyes darting to her stomach with disapproval. She nodded. Sorry, but we need someone more flexible. The rejection after rejection nearly broke her. She sat outside the diner that day, shivering against the cold, watching the world move on around her like she didn't exist. And she realized just how easy it was to become invisible. Just how easy it was to be forgotten. That night, she curled up on the motel bed, hands resting on her swollen belly, whispering to her unborn children. It's okay, she murmured, tears slipping down her cheeks. We'll figure this out. But she had never been more scared in her life. At 6 months pregnant, Isabel hit rock bottom. She had run out of money. Her motel room was gone. And she had nowhere to go. The shelter was full that night. The woman at the front desk had been apologetic. But there was no space for a single mother to be. So she wandered. The streets were bitterly cold. And Isabel wrapped her coat tightly around herself, ignoring the sharp pang of hunger twisting in her stomach. She didn't realize how weak she had become until her vision blurred, her legs giving out beneath her. The last thing she remembered was falling. And then, darkness. When she woke up, warmth surrounded her, blinking against the bright hospital lights. She felt a rough yet gentle hand clasp hers. She turned her head and met the concerned gaze of a stranger. You're awake, he said softly. She frowned, trying to sit up. Where am I? The clinic. You collapsed on the sidewalk. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The babies. Her hands flew to her belly. A cry of relief escaping her lips when she felt the gentle kicks beneath her fingertips. They're okay, the man reassured her, his voice filled with quiet kindness. But you need to take care of yourself. You were dehydrated, undernourished, pushing your body past its limits. She swallowed the lump in her throat. Who are you? She whispered. He smiled gently. Andrew. I'm a doctor at the community clinic. That night, for the first time in months, Isabel slept in a warm, safe place. Andrew had arranged for her to stay in a small temporary shelter for women, somewhere she wouldn't be turned away. Somewhere she could rest and recover. It was the first act of kindness she had received in a long time, and she never forgot it. With Andrew's help, Isabel found her footing again. She got a small studio apartment, a job at a local cafe, and slowly, day by day, rebuilt her life. When the twins, Liam and Noah, were born, she held them in her arms and cried. She had done it. She had fought. She had survived. She had built a life for them, without Ethan, without the Callaways, without anyone who had once made her feel unworthy. For 6 years, Isabel worked tirelessly. She sacrificed everything to make sure her boys were safe, loved, and never had to feel the hunger and fear she once had. She never dated, never let herself get close to anyone. Because men like Ethan weren't meant to be trusted. Andrew had stayed in her life. A quiet support system who never pressured her for anything more. He was there when she needed a friend, a helping hand. But Isabel had built walls around herself, around her heart, because love had destroyed her once before. And she would never let it happen again. She had finally found peace. Until that day at the airport. Until she looked up and saw Ethan Callaway standing in front of her, eyes wide with disbelief, staring at their children, until he whispered her name, a name she never thought she would hear from his lips again. And all the pain, all the heartbreak, all the years of struggle came crashing down on her at once. He had left her to suffer. He had abandoned her to fight alone. And now, after all this time, after all these years, he dared to look at her with regret? With longing? She wouldn't let him hurt her again. She wouldn't let him walk back into her life as if he hadn't destroyed her. So when he asked, "Are they mine?" she stood tall, her heart racing, and she told the only truth that mattered. "They're my sons." The moment Ethan Callaway stepped into her world again, Isabel felt like the air had been stolen from her lungs. She had spent the last 7 years rebuilding her life after he threw her away, after he made her feel like she was worthless, disposable, nothing. And now? Now he was standing right in front of her, looking at her children like he had a right to know them. The very children he never even knew existed. "Are they mine?" His voice was low, hesitant, as if he already knew the answer but needed to hear it from her lips. Isabel's heart pounded so hard it hurt. She clenched her fists at her sides, her entire body trembling, not with fear, but with anger, with pain, with years of buried resentment clawing to the surface. How dare he? How dare he come back now? After all this time, acting like he had any right to ask that question. She could feel the eyes of Liam and Noah on her, watching, confused. They were too young to understand what was happening, but they knew something was wrong. She had spent their entire lives protecting them from this moment, protecting them from the man who had abandoned her. Isabel lifted her chin, forcing herself to stay calm. "They're my sons." The words were cold, final. Ethan flinched like she had just struck him, and for a split second, she saw something flash in his eyes: guilt, regret. But it was too late for regrets. The time for apologies had passed years ago. "Isabel," he took a step forward, but she immediately put a hand out, stopping him. "Don't," she snapped, her voice sharper than she intended. "You don't get to say my name like it means something to you. Not after what you did." Ethan's jaw tightened, his hands clenching at his sides. "I never meant to hurt you." A bitter laugh tore from her throat. "You never meant to hurt me?" she repeated, her voice dripping with disbelief. "You threw me away like garbage. You walked away, left me with nothing, and now you're standing here. Expecting what? Forgiveness? A second chance?" His lips parted, but he had no words. Because he knew she was right. She could see it in his eyes. But that didn't erase the years of suffering she had endured. That didn't change the fact that she had spent nights crying herself to sleep, wondering how she would feed her children. That didn't change the fact that she had built a life for them without him. And now he was back, looking at Liam and Noah like they were something he had the right to claim. "I need to talk to you," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. "Please." "No." Isabel turned to her boys, forcing herself to push the past aside, to be strong for them. "Come on, let's go," she said softly. But before she could walk away, Ethan did something that shattered every ounce of control she had left. "I made a mistake," he whispered. She froze. The words stabbed through her like a blade. Slowly, she turned back to him, her chest rising and falling with years of pent-up rage. "You don't get to say that," she hissed, stepping closer, her eyes burning with unshed tears. "You don't get to stand here and tell me it was a mistake. You didn't just make a mistake. Ethan, you ruined me." Her voice broke on the last word, but she didn't let herself fall apart. Not in front of him. Not after everything. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, his face pale. "I know," he said quietly, "and I will never forgive myself for it." She shook her head, laughter bubbling up from the sheer absurdity of it all. "You don't get to decide if you forgive yourself," she shot back. "You don't get to come back into my life just because you suddenly regret your choices." "I didn't know." "Because you didn't care." She cut him off. "You never cared. Ethan, you left. You moved on. And now you're here because what? You just happened to run into me at an airport?" Ethan swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "I was looking for you," he admitted. Her heart stopped. "What?" "I was looking for you," he repeated. I found out what my mother did. What she said to you. I know everything now." Isabel. Her blood ran cold. For years, she had believed that Ethan had willingly left her, that he had chosen his family's legacy over their love. But now he was telling her there was more to the story? "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice shaking. He exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. "My mother lied to me," he confessed. "She told me you never wanted children, that you were planning to leave me, that you were unfaithful." His voice cracked, and I believed her. A sharp pain stabbed through Isabel's chest. "She told you that?" she whispered, her eyes burning. He nodded, looking like he hated himself. "And I was stupid enough to believe her." Isabel felt like the ground beneath her had shattered. All this time, she had thought he had left her because he didn't love her enough. But the truth was so much worse. Ethan had left because he had been manipulated. Because his mother had poisoned his mind, fed him lies, twisted their love into something ugly and broken. The anger inside her shifted. It was still there, still burning. But now, it wasn't just directed at Ethan. It was at the woman who had taken everything from her. The woman who had stolen the future she was supposed to have. Isabel's breath hitched, and for the first time since seeing him again, she felt something other than anger. She felt grief. She had spent so many years hating him. So many years telling herself that he had never loved her. But now she knew the truth. Ethan had loved her. He had just been too weak to fight for her. And in the end, that weakness had cost them everything. A long silence stretched between them. Ethan's hands trembled. "I know it's too late," He murmured, I know I can't undo the past. But please, Isabel, let me be in their lives. She swallowed hard, turning away. The past couldn't be changed. She couldn't erase the pain, the suffering, the heartbreak. But Liam and Noah, they deserved the truth. They deserved to know the man who had once been too blind to fight for them. I don't know if I can ever forgive you, she whispered. Ethan nodded slowly. I don't expect you to. She closed her eyes, breathing deeply, then finally turned to her boys. They were watching her, waiting for her to tell them what to do. And in that moment, she made a choice. Not for Ethan, not for herself, but for them. Liam, Noah, she said softly, kneeling down to their level. This is someone from Mommy's past. His name is Ethan. The boys looked up at Ethan with curious eyes. Ethan stared at them, his entire body shaking. His sons, his heart, his second chance. Tears filled his eyes as he whispered, Hi. And just like that, the past met the present. And the future? It was still unwritten. What do you think Isabel should do? Should she let Ethan into her sons' lives? Or keep him out forever? Tell us in the comments. If you were moved by her strength, hit like to support her. Subscribe now, because the real battle is just beginning. Ethan Calloway had made many mistakes in his life. Some were business decisions that cost him money. Others were misjudgments that cost him friendships, trust, and love. But nothing, compared to the mistake of walking away from Isabel. From the woman he had once promised to love forever. And now, standing in front of her, looking at his sons, his flesh and blood, he realized just how much his mistake had truly cost him. 7 years. 7 years of birthdays he missed. 7 years of laughter he never got to hear. 7 years of first steps, first words, first everything. And all because he had believed a lie. Now, he was here, standing before her, trying to undo the damage of a lifetime. But Isabel's eyes told him everything. She didn't trust him. She didn't believe that he deserved a place in their lives. And honestly, she was right. He had no right to be here. No right to ask anything of her. But he had to try. For them. For his sons. For the family he never knew he had. Isabel crossed her arms, her face unreadable. You really think you can just come back into their lives after all this time? Her words hit like a bullet. No, he didn't think that. But he wanted to. I don't know what I think, Ethan admitted, his voice raw. I just know that I can't walk away. Not again. Isabel let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. I don't know if you realize this, she said, her voice laced with pain. But walking away is the only thing you've ever done. Ethan felt his chest tighten. She wasn't wrong. He had walked away from their love. He had walked away from her when she needed him most. And now, looking at the two little boys who were watching this conversation with wide, curious eyes, he knew he had walked away from them, too. Isabel, his voice broke, but he forced himself to continue. I know I can't undo the past. But I need to be in their lives. Please. She swallowed hard, her eyes flickering with something dangerous, something fragile. Fear. Fear that if she let him in, he would leave again. Fear that if she gave him another chance, it would break her all over again. And maybe she was right to be afraid. Maybe Ethan really was too late. But he had spent 7 years living a life that felt empty. He had spent 7 years thinking something was missing, never realizing that it was them. And now? Now, he would rather die than lose them again. I don't know if I can ever forgive you. Isabel's voice was barely a whisper, but it cut deeper than a knife. He nodded. I don't expect you to. A long silence stretched between them. Liam and Noah shifted beside their mother, watching with silent curiosity. Ethan turned to them, his heart hammering. They were still so young. Would they even want to know him? Would they even care? He crouched down to their level, his hands shaking. He had stood in boardrooms, negotiated million-dollar deals, faced ruthless men who would kill to win. And yet nothing had ever made him feel as terrified as looking into the eyes of his own children. Hey, guys. His voice was soft, hesitant. I'm Ethan. Liam blinked at him, tilting his head. Noah, the quieter of the two, simply stared. Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat. What was he even supposed to say? He had no idea how to talk to kids. No idea how to bridge the 7-year chasm that separated them. He had lost the chance to be there when they were born. He had lost the chance to hold them as babies, to see their first smiles, to rock them to sleep when they cried. He had lost everything. But maybe, just maybe, he hadn't lost them forever. Do you like dinosaurs? Liam's eyes brightened. I love dinosaurs. Noah still didn't speak, but his lips quirked slightly. Ethan's chest loosened, just a little, a tiny crack in the wall between them. Me too, Ethan said, forcing a smile. Maybe we can talk about dinosaurs sometime. Liam nodded eagerly. Noah hesitated, then shrugged. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Ethan looked up at Isabel, silently pleading. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. He could tell she wanted to stop this, to shut him out. But for the first time, he saw something else in her expression. Hesitation. Because no matter how much she hated him, she loved her sons more. She would never deny them something they wanted. And right now, Liam and Noah wanted to know him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Isabel spoke. Her voice was hoarse, unsteady. If you hurt them, Ethan, she didn't finish the sentence. But she didn't have to. He already knew. I won't. For the first time in years, Ethan felt like he had something worth fighting for. Something worth changing for. This wasn't about making things right with Isabel. It wasn't about fixing their broken love. It was about being the father he had never been. And no matter what it took, he wasn't going to walk away again. Not ever. Ethan Calloway sat alone in his dimly lit penthouse, staring out at the city that once belonged to him. The skyline twinkled like 1,000 promises. But tonight, it felt hollow. For years, he had everything, a fortune most people could only dream of, a reputation as an unstoppable businessman, and the respect that came with his name. But now, he had nothing. At least, nothing that mattered. Because what good is wealth when your own children don't even know you exist? Ethan pressed his fingers against his temples, frustration building inside him. He had met them, Liam and Noah, his sons, the two little boys who carried his blood, who had his same sharp eyes, his same stubborn expressions. They were his. And yet, they didn't know him. Not really. He had been a stranger to them their whole lives. And now that he was back, he could see it, the uncertainty in their eyes, the wariness in their mother's gaze. Isabel had every reason to shut him out. She had raised them alone. She had carried the weight of their futures, their dreams, their every scraped knee and whispered bedtime story. While he had been living in a lie, believing she had betrayed him, believing she had moved on, when the truth was, she had been left behind, heartbroken, abandoned, and pregnant with the children he had unknowingly turned his back on. Ethan let out a slow breath, his chest tight. This wasn't going to be easy. But for the first time in his life, he was willing to fight for something other than money and power. For them, for the family he had lost, for the love he had thrown away. The next morning, Ethan stood outside Isabel's small home, clutching a bag of books and toys in his hand. He had never felt so nervous. Not even when he closed million-dollar deals. Not even when he stood before powerful men who wanted to see him fail. This was real, and he couldn't afford to fail. Taking a deep breath, he knocked. The door opened, and Isabel stood there, her expression unreadable. She didn't say anything for a moment, just studied him. Then, finally, she sighed. They're in the backyard. Ethan swallowed hard and nodded. She didn't say she trusted him. She didn't say she forgave him. But she let him in. And for now, that was enough. The backyard was small, with a swing set slightly rusted at the edges. Liam and Noah sat under a tree, playing with a toy truck. Ethan's throat tightened. They were so much smaller than he had imagined. So much more fragile. For years, he had pictured them in his head. But nothing prepared him for the reality of seeing them, hearing them, knowing that he had already missed so much. Liam looked up first. His eyes narrowed slightly, like he was trying to figure Ethan out. Noah, on the other hand, barely spared him a glance. Too busy building a dirt road for the truck. Ethan cleared his throat. Hey, guys. Silence. Awkward. Painful. He crouched down, setting the bag beside them. I brought some books. And, some dinosaurs. That got their attention. Liam's eyes flickered with interest. Dinosaurs? Ethan nodded, pulling out a few small figures. I heard you liked them. Liam reached for a T-Rex, turning it over in his hands. This one's cool. Ethan felt something loosen in his chest. A small victory. Noah, however, remained silent. Ethan watched him, trying to understand. He wasn't ignoring him, not completely. But he was holding back. And Ethan understood that better than anyone. "You don't talk much, huh?" he asked gently. Noah finally looked up, his small fingers gripping the toy truck. Isabel's voice floated from the porch. "He's shy." Ethan turned slightly. She was watching them, her arms crossed, her expression guarded. "He doesn't warm up to people quickly," she added. Ethan nodded. "That's okay." Noah blinked, as if surprised by the response. Ethan smiled softly. "I used to be shy, too, when I was your age." Liam snorted. "You don't look shy." Ethan chuckled. "Yeah, well, people change." The words held a weight he didn't intend. He had changed. At least, he was trying to. Noah hesitated. Then, finally, he reached for a dinosaur. A small, hesitant movement, but it meant everything. The hours passed, and slowly, something shifted. Liam started talking more, telling Ethan all about his favorite dinosaurs, his favorite books. Noah didn't talk much, but he started listening. He would glance at Ethan every now and then, his tiny brows furrowing like he was trying to figure him out. And Ethan let them lead the pace. Because he knew that trust wasn't something he could demand. It was something he had to earn. And he would, no matter how long it took. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Isabel called them in for dinner. Ethan stood, dusting off his jeans, watching as Liam and Noah ran ahead. He turned to Isabel, his heart in his throat. "They're incredible," he murmured. A flicker of emotion crossed her face. "Yes," she said softly, "they are." He hesitated. He wanted to say more. To tell her that he was sorry. To beg her to give him another chance. But he knew better. Instead, he simply said, "Thank you for today." Isabel's lips pressed together. She looked away. And then, after a long moment, she nodded. It wasn't an invitation. It wasn't forgiveness. But it wasn't a goodbye either. And for Ethan, that was enough. For now, Ethan Calloway had spent his entire life chasing success, power, and control. But now, for the first time, he was chasing something he wasn't sure he could ever have again: his family. It had been weeks since he first met Liam and Noah. His sons, the children he never knew existed. Weeks since Isabel, the woman he had once loved and lost, allowed him back into their lives, hesitantly, cautiously. He understood her doubt. He deserved it. But the more time he spent with his boys, the more he realized just how much he had missed. Noah's soft laughter when he thought no one was watching. Liam's determination to prove he was the smartest in the room. The way they curled up next to Isabel on the couch after a long day. Safe, warm, loved. A love he should have been there to give them. But instead, he had walked away. And now, every time he looked at them, the guilt was suffocating. Every bedtime story he missed. Every birthday that passed without him. Every scraped knee. Every school recital. Every whispered, "I love you," before bed. He had missed it all. And no matter what he did now, he could never get that time back. But maybe he could still be the father they deserved. If only Isabel would let him. It was a quiet evening when Ethan finally allowed himself to hope. Liam and Noah had spent the whole day with him, running through the park, their laughter filling the air. For the first time, it felt real. It wasn't forced. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was natural. Noah had reached for his hand without hesitation. Liam had called him Dad, without even realizing it. The word had sent a shock through Ethan's system, a single syllable, filled with so much meaning. For a moment, he had felt whole. But as they returned to Isabel's house, reality crashed down on him. As he stepped inside, following the boys, he saw him, Andrew, sitting at the kitchen table, comfortable, at ease, like he belonged there. Because he did. Ethan's stomach twisted. Andrew looked up, offering a polite nod, but Ethan could see it in his eyes, the quiet warning. The unspoken truth. This wasn't Ethan's home. This wasn't his family. Not anymore. Isabel stepped in, placing a gentle hand on Andrew's shoulder. A familiar touch. A quiet reassurance. And just like that, Ethan felt like an outsider all over again. He swallowed hard, forcing a neutral expression. "Thanks for bringing them home," Isabel said, her voice steady, unreadable. Ethan nodded, but his throat was tight. He glanced at the boys, his boys, as they ran toward the living room. Completely unaware of the battle raging inside him. He wanted to stay. He wanted to be part of this. But instead, he forced a small smile. "Good night," he said softly. Then, before he could let the pain show, he turned and walked away. That night, Ethan sat in his car, staring at the city lights. He had built this empire. He had climbed to the top. But none of it mattered anymore. He had spent his whole life proving he was the best, proving he could succeed at anything. And yet, when it came to the one thing that truly mattered, his family, he had already lost. The realization hit him like a blow to the chest. Because no matter how much time he spent with Liam and Noah, no matter how much he tried to make up for the past, at the end of the day, they had a home, they had a life, and it was a life he wasn't part of. A life that belonged to someone else. To Andrew. And the truth? The truth was that maybe they were better off without him. Maybe Isabel was right to keep her distance. Maybe the best thing he could do for them was let them go. Ethan didn't know why he ended up back at Isabel's house. He wasn't thinking. He just knew he couldn't walk away. Not like this. Not again. He knocked, his heart pounding, his hands clenched into fists to stop them from shaking. When Isabel opened the door, her brows furrowed in confusion. "Ethan?" He exhaled sharply. "Can we talk?" She hesitated, then sighed, stepping aside. "The boys are asleep." "Good," he said, stepping inside, "because this is about us." Her jaw tightened. "Ethan, I can't do this." His voice cracked. She stilled, her arms crossing over her chest. "Do what?" He let out a breath, struggling for control. "Watching someone else raise my kids." The words hung in the air like a confession. Isabel's expression hardened. "You don't get to say that," she whispered. "You left. I didn't know, but you still left." Her voice trembled. "I had to do it alone. Ethan, and now you think you can just show up and, what? Take over? Act like the past doesn't matter?" His chest ached. "That's not what I'm trying to do." "Then what do you want?" "You." The word almost slipped out. But he bit it back. Because he had no right to say it. Instead, he closed his eyes, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I just want to be in their lives." Isabel stared at him for a long moment. Then, quietly, she said, "You already are." It should have been comforting. But instead, it felt like a slow, painful goodbye. Because she didn't say, "we." She didn't say he was part of her life. Only theirs. And maybe that was all he could ask for. But it wasn't enough. Not for him. Never for him. Ethan left that night knowing one thing. He loved them too much to be the reason they were unhappy. And if that meant stepping aside, if that meant letting them go, then maybe, for the first time in his life, he had to put someone else before himself. Because love wasn't just about fighting. Sometimes, love meant knowing when to walk away. Even when it shattered you. Even when it left you broken. Even when it hurt more than anything in the world. Ethan Calloway stood at the edge of the park, watching from a distance as Liam and Noah laughed and ran through the playground. The golden sunlight hit their small faces, making them glow with a joy so pure, so innocent, that it made his heart ache. They were happy. They were his sons. And yet, he wasn't sure if he had the right to be here, to stand in their world like he belonged. Because the truth was, he had left. He had missed years of their lives. He had missed first steps, first words, first birthdays. And now, he was just a man standing at a distance, wondering if he could ever make up for lost time. A part of him thought about turning around, walking away, letting them have the life they had built without him. But then, Liam turned. He spotted Ethan, his face lighting up. "Dad." The word shook Ethan to his core. It was the first time Liam had ever said it without hesitation. Without doubt. Without fear. And just like that, all of Ethan's insecurities melted away. Because this was where he belonged. And he wasn't going anywhere. As Ethan stepped forward, Noah ran toward him, his small arms wrapping around his leg. Ethan bent down, scooping his youngest son into his arms. "Did you see me, Dad?" Noah asked excitedly. "I went down the slide all by myself." Ethan chuckled, ruffling his hair. "I did. You're getting braver every day." Liam grinned, tugging at Ethan's sleeve. "Come push us on the swings?" Ethan hesitated. This felt surreal, natural, like he was a part of something again. And then, he saw Isabel. She stood near the benches, watching them with unreadable eyes. Ethan's chest tightened. Would she tell him to leave? Would she tell the boys not to get attached? Would she remind him, again, that he wasn't part of their life anymore? He braced himself. But then, she smiled. A small, hesitant smile. A smile that told him, maybe, just maybe, she was ready to let him in. That evening, after putting the boys to bed, Ethan and Isabel sat on the front porch, wrapped in the warmth of a late summer night. For a while, they didn't speak. They just sat in the silence, letting the past linger between them. Finally, Ethan sighed. I thought you'd tell me to leave today. Isabel glanced at him. I thought about it. His heart clenched. And? She exhaled, running a hand through her hair. And I realized I don't want to fight anymore. Ethan turned to her, his throat tight. She looked tired, not physically, but emotionally. For 7 years, she had done it all alone. And it had changed her, made her stronger, made her cautious, and made her afraid to trust him again. I hurt you, he admitted, and no matter what I do, I can't change that. She swallowed, looking away. No, you can't, but I can be better, he said, his voice raw with emotion. For them, for you. She looked back at him, her dark eyes filled with something he couldn't quite place. Hope? Fear? Maybe a little of both. What do you want, Ethan? She whispered. He didn't hesitate. You, them, a family. Tears filled her eyes, and she let out a soft, shaky laugh. Ethan Calloway, the billionaire who thought he had everything, and now he just wants bedtime stories and soccer games. He smiled, reaching for her hand. I want it all. The chaos, the mess, the love. Isabel bit her lip. You can't just come back and expect things to go back to the way they were. I know, he whispered. I don't want the past. I want a new future. With you. She hesitated. And then, slowly, she nodded. It didn't happen overnight. They had too much history. Too many wounds. Too many scars to pretend everything was perfect. But little by little, they found their way back to each other. Ethan started coming around more. Not just as a visitor. Not just as a man trying to make up for the past. But as a father. As a partner. He was there for school drop-offs. He was there for weekend trips to the zoo. He was there when Noah got sick and refused to take his medicine. So Ethan made up an entire superhero story about how medicine gives kids super strength. He was there when Liam had a bad dream and crawled into his bed in the middle of the night. And most importantly, he was there for Isabel. Through the quiet moments. Through the hard ones. Through everything. Until one day, Isabel looked at him and didn't feel fear anymore. She didn't feel resentment. She didn't feel doubt. She just felt love. And when Ethan pulled her close one evening, she didn't pull away. She let herself love him again. 1 year later, Ethan stood at the altar, watching as Isabel walked toward him. Her smile was radiant, her eyes filled with tears. And when she finally reached him, he took her hands, gripping them tightly. I never thought I'd get another chance, he whispered. She squeezed his fingers. Then don't waste it. The officiant smiled. And as they exchanged vows, with Liam and Noah standing proudly beside them, Ethan knew he had spent his whole life chasing success. And yet, this woman, these boys, this family, they were his greatest achievement. And he would never, ever let them go again. Life doesn't always give second chances. And when it does, it's up to us to take them. Ethan had power, money, and success, but it meant nothing without the people he loved. Sometimes, we don't realize what matters most until it's too late. But if we're lucky, if we fight hard enough, if we open our hearts, even when it's scary, we can find our way back. So if there's someone in your life you love, tell them, fight for them, because at the end of the day, love is the only thing that truly lasts. What do you think? Did Ethan deserve his second chance? Comment below. If this story touched your heart, hit like to support Ethan and Isabel. Don't forget to subscribe for more heartwarming stories like this. Because love always finds a way. And sometimes, the best stories are the ones we fight for.